The reason I wrote The Next 100 Years is that it allowed me to make forecasts that could never be disproven. I found the way to be a bestseller and resist all criticism. Unfortunately, they asked me next to write the next decade, and they may catch up to me. And given the publishing business, I'm expecting to write the next year sometime soon. Forecasting is complex, but it boils down to one thing. It's eliminating the impossible and believing the things you see in front of you. And that's very hard, because people tend to think that the things in front of them are solid and unchangeable. In 1989, I completed what was the finest computerized war game for DoD on the Warsaw Pact NATO balance. It analyzed precisely how the war was going to be fought. It was superb. The tragedy of my life was that the Soviet Union collapsed and we didn't get a chance to fight the war. I'm a strange person. But the fact is that very few people expected the collapse of the Soviet Union. It was solid, it was overwhelming, it was tremendously powerful, it was going to be there for a very long time. And yet it was gone. This is, in retrospect, obvious that it was gone. Why did people not expect it to happen? Because they didn't believe what was in front of their eyes. They had a preconception of the Soviet Union, a preconception of the world. They knew the Cold War would go on forever. And nothing goes on forever. So the way you forecast is not by asking what will go on forever, but asking what will change. Ever since 1991, where we saw extraordinary things happen in 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed. Japan, an economic miracle that would never end. We should all start learning Japanese and hold hands in quality circles. Ended. The Maastricht Treaty was signed, creating the European Union. Tiananmen Square took place, defining modern China and the way it would function. And Desert Storm was fought. It was a very short period of time, and everything we thought was true about the world changed. And then when you look back and you realize about every 20 years, this happens. There's nothing new. The things that you think are eternal aren't. The way the world works evolves, and you will, until the last minute, believe that it will be there forever. And even after Japan collapsed, people waited for when would it come back to the way it was? And the answer is never. Once it's done, it's over. And that's really what led me into forecasting. Having spent a great deal of time worrying about the Soviet Army, the Red Army, I now discovered that, boy, was I in the wrong business. And so I started thinking about the question, how can the future be understood? Because, as Yogi Berra said, we'll all be living in the future. When I look at the world after this period I talked about, 89, 91, three major pillars emerged in the international scene. The United States, of course, emerged as the world's only superpower, for the first time in its history unchallenged, because up until then you had the Cold War, and let me tell you, that was scary. It wasn't clear that we were going to win. You had a united Europe emerging that was going to become a place of enlightenment, of prosperity, and of peace, and would balance the United States. And China was the new Japan. Forever it would grow without interruption, permanently, forever and ever. We are now, ever since 2008, in a period of readjustment, exactly as we were in 89, 91, where two of these three pillars are tottering and one is starting to behave differently. Let's begin with Europe. Europe, the place of enlightenment, where war had been abolished, where all power was soft. I never understood what that was, but they talk about soft power. where people were going to be perpetually nice, even when they didn't have to be. It was a place of employment, of prosperity, and of growth. Then 2008 hit, and they encountered their first financial crisis. Now, this was the fourth financial crisis for the United States since World War II. The first was the municipal bond crisis of the 1970s. Then there was the Third World Debt Crisis. Then there was the S&L crisis, savings and loan crisis, and then this one. And it always ended the same way. The government wrote a huge check, bailed everybody out. A bunch of investment bankers stole a bunch of it, perfectly legally. There wasn't anything dishonest. Investigations were held, and life went on. The problem in Europe was it wasn't ready for this crisis. It didn't expect it, and it constructed itself in such a way. Imagine if the United States, in solving this crisis, had to engage in negotiations with the state of Louisiana. I've lived there. Trust me, this wouldn't have happened. And that was the problem of Europe. The problem of Europe also is this. It was a problem of Germany, the perpetual problem of Europe. Because Germany derives the equivalent of 40% of its GDP from exports. It is an export junkie. That's a higher percentage than China. Its industrial plant, its economy is too large for its own consumption. It can only survive if it has export markets. If it lost those markets, it would be catastrophic. For Germany, the European Union was a godsend. It was a free trade zone. They couldn't stop you from selling things there. And Germany took full advantage of it, as you would imagine. The problem was that the other countries of Europe were overwhelmed by German efficiency. Germany became what it was because the United States permitted it to protect its markets from the United States, but have free access to American markets. Germany wasn't able to provide the same thing. So when the crisis happened, all of these countries in Southern Europe and Eastern Europe slowed down. Their tax base contracted, and you wound up with a sovereign debt crisis. These countries couldn't pay their debt. There was a question, how do we handle this problem, the Europeans said. Those who were debtors said, why don't you give us money to pay the debt? Those who were creditors said, why don't you choke on it? Not an odd conversation. And so the decision was made to go to austerity. Austerity meant, in the case of Greece, for example, that huge numbers of employees, doctors, because they have a nationalized healthcare system, electrical workers, because the electrical system was nationalized, were laid off. We have a friend who's an architect who worked for the government, as most people did. He used to earn $3,000 a month, 3,000 euros a month, and his salary was cut to 800. And unemployment in Greece rose to 26%. Unemployment in Spain rose to 27%. Unemployment in Southern Europe, Southern France, Southern Italy, rose to 20%. In the Great Depression in the United States, the highest point of unemployment was 25%. Southern Europe is in depression. It's not in recession because it is impossible to get it out of there by stimulus. To have a stimulus, you need to have companies that can use it and buy and build things. So you're going to build bridges. You need companies. 50% of all Spanish construction companies have gone bankrupt. 52% actually. So if you give a stimulus, who's going to do the work? This is the same problem the United States had, why Roosevelt couldn't get the economy out of the doldrums. Couldn't get out of there because the companies were gone. It was only World War II when essentially the United States nationalized the entire economy that they got it working. What happened in Europe, however, was that now every nation was protecting itself. When the leaders of Europe sat down, they were not as leaders of Europe. It was the president of Greece meeting the chancellor of Germany, meeting the president of France, meeting the prime minister of Italy, and they spoke for their countries and their interests, and these interests diverged. And the most frightening thing was the divergence between France and Germany. France went to war in Mali. Germany refused to help it. France wants stimulus. Germany wants austerity. Europe has completely shifted away from a transnational entity to an arena like the United Nations, where nations fight and struggle with each other. Financial community, when you read the Financial Times, says everything's fine, the banks are okay. The cost of it was a catastrophic unemployment. And the people who were unemployed were not the poor people, they were middle-class people. People who had had homes, people who had futures, who took care of their children's education, and they have lost their middle-class life. When the poor get poorer, they can manage it psychologically. But when somebody who works as a doctor has his pay cut by 75% and loses his house, as happens in Southern Europe, his entire future is changed. Unemployment for the young, anyone under 25%, in Southern Europe is at about 60 to 65% unemployed. And there is no hope that they're going to be employed. So Europe is facing catastrophe. The banks aren't facing catastrophe, so Financial Times is saying we've got this under control. But growing up in these countries are radical right-wing movements. Golden Dawn in Greece, Five Star in Italy, Jobbik in Hungary. You may say, well, these are little parties. But this situation has not existed in Europe since the 1920s. And the little man with a mustache who grew out of this nonsensical party had to be taken seriously. When you look at Europe, and this is what I did in my book at the time that I wrote it, this was an unsustainable exercise. You cannot have at the center of a free trade zone a country that exports as much as Germany does. How would Canada fare in NAFTA if the United States exported 40% of its economy? Where would you be? Well, you wouldn't be in NAFTA, for one thing. But that was what Germany was, and it worked perfectly so long as there was prosperity. China also got hammered by 2008. Everybody loves the fact that these were great exporting powers. What they don't realize is exporters are dependent on their customers' ability to do business. If your customer is an idiot and buys subprime bonds, he's not going to buy your stuff. And China's real problem was the most powerful entity in the world, the Republic of Walmart, that stopped buying. China's number one goal is full employment for their workers, because in China, 650 million people live in households earning less than $2 a day. 400 million live in households earning between $2 and $4 a day. 60 million live in households earning $20,000 a year or more. China is a third world country, breathtakingly impoverished. Simply leave Shanghai and drive 20 miles west, and you'll see it. The Chinese have to have full employment. But they haven't had, therefore, a recession in 30 years. And it is a highly inefficient economy. Businesses that should go out of business can't be allowed to because they'd lay people off. And therefore, money is lent to them to stay in business. And when they can't pay back the money, more money is lent to them to pay back the loan, so you don't have to book it as a non-performing loan. And the result of this lending policy in a country that doesn't have the ability to consume products is inflation. Until today, Chinese wages are higher than wages in Mexico. And Chinese companies are relocating in Latin America, in Mexico, in Africa. The number of Chinese countries leaving China is stunning. Now, people will say, well, this is the greatness of China. These are the same people who said, oh my God, the Japanese bought Pebble Beach. What power? And the answer was, the Japanese were willing to buy anything that wasn't in Japan. And the old saying that watch the insiders and don't go against them applied. And it applies to China. China is deeply flawed. It will not collapse, it will not disappear. But it will no longer be able to behave the way it did. And when you are selling at a loss, of course you're going to go fast. Is there a company in the world, if it's willing to take a loss, that can't grow its revenue? Can it grow its profits? And this is the problem that China faces. So 2 of the 3 pillars of the international system are in crisis. And in my view, an existential crisis. They will not recover to the way they were before. And if you take a look at Europe in 2005 and look at it today, you would not recognize it. And if you look at China in 2005 and look at it today, you would not recognize it. It's like boiling a frog. You get used to the change until you step back and say, hey, that's a dead frog. What's it doing in the soup? Who's the winner? The big, stupid, and dumb one. The United States. The United States was forecast to collapse by all leading economists after it started borrowing money. It didn't. My objection to economists is not that they're wrong, it's that when they're wrong, they don't tell me why. Well, they were wrong for a very simple and strange reason. When I look at a business, I ask 3 things. What's its revenue? What's its debts? What is its net worth? Economists judge countries by taking their total debt, regardless of what it falls due, comparing it to 1 year's revenue, the GDP, and holding their heads. You have to take a look at the national net worth, which is something that we do, to understand that Japan has withstood 20 years that it should not have withstood. The United States has withstood it because it has an extremely high net worth. Iceland, however, with a gross national product of 1 herring, and it couldn't stand a much smaller hit. Size matters, and you can't get away from the fact that the economists, as they analyze nations, are not the way geopoliticians would analyze nations. We look at the structural capability of the nation and cost out the debt over time, not looking at 1 year's revenue as its sole base, which is a simple way of saying, if I took a look at what you guys may owe in money at 1 year's salary, I figure you're all bankrupt. But you're not. You have assets. And this is what, when you deal with the economists, and I've had lots of conversations, becomes complex, because they say, how can you measure the net worth, and how can you monetize the net worth? Well, monetizing net worth is easy. You print money, which is a flat tax against everybody. It's not equitable. There's some things that can't be monetized, but it works. How do you measure it? It's really not important to measure it. Drive around the United States, you'll see there's a lot of stuff there. You don't always need a quantitative analysis to tell you, hey, they're rich. But the United States is redefining the way it behaves in the world, because the United States is an empire. Almost 25% of the world's GDP is produced in the United States. The United States is the first power in human history to control all of the oceans. And the United States was completely unprepared for being this. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, I could assure you, no one was more shocked than the United States government. It took them 2 years to ground the B-52s. They kept going on patrol because the government couldn't really believe what happened. For the first time in history, the United States had no enemies. So what did we do? We found some. We're good at that. We approached 9/11, which was a serious event, as an occasion for 2 multi-divisional wars with no clear strategic goal. We were young, we were stupid. When we think back on the past, we all have moments in our lives where we did this. This was an entire country. But the US was stunned with the position. And so now we see it changing. The bar of intervention is raising higher and higher. The United States went into Lebanon at the urgings of Libya, at the urgings of France. And having gone into Lebanon at the urgings of France, discovered that the French didn't exactly want help, they wanted us to do it, because they didn't have the aircraft that was necessary. Well, that taught us something, because it didn't really end very well for the United States. When everybody said it's time to go into Syria, the president got excited, and it looked like he would, and then he said, you know what? Maybe we won't go into Syria. He did something else. He opened negotiations with the Iranians. How did Rome, how did Britain manage their empires? Not by sending everybody rushing off into every part of the empire that was in chaos. They did it by something called the balance of power. And the balance of power simply means, why don't you and he fight? This was Ronald Reagan's strategy on Iran and Iraq. He never went to war with anybody. He just encouraged them to go to war with each other, and they didn't need much encouragement. And so the United States is now doing the most important part of this. The United States has been an ascending curve since 1870. It is the longest, barely uninterrupted growth curve, the Depression being the only major event. And if you look at the Depression and its effect, it's on a long curve, it was hardly visible. It is on a continent where its only fear is the Canadians will attack. It is secure. It is a place that is secure. It is the only nation native to the Atlantic and the Pacific, so it engages in trade in both areas very efficiently. And it is a nation that is extraordinarily productive, partly because of its geography, and partly because of the fact that the United States takes people from everywhere. And if they don't turn them into Americans, they do turn them into engineers. What is happening in Iran represents the new strategy of the United States. The Iranians have a nuclear program. They do not have a nuclear weapon. And they've had a nuclear program for a long time, and they still don't have a nuclear weapon. Because building a nuclear weapon is very hard. Anybody could enrich uranium. Then you have enriched uranium. To build a weapon, you have to ruggedize it, miniaturize it, do advanced electronics. Otherwise, and build a missile. Otherwise, when you fire it and it lands in the middle of Tel Aviv and the tail says made in Iran, all hell breaks loose. You don't want to do that. It's extremely important to understand what Iran is doing. It uses its nuclear program not because it thinks having a nuclear weapon is useful, but it's a great way to get someone's attention. And Iran was moving brilliantly. It had created a sphere of influence that ran from Afghanistan to Lebanon. Iraq was under its control after we left. So was Syria. And then in Syria, things got rough, and its boy Assad was in trouble. And then they got rough in Iraq, and suddenly the sanctions started to work, and they were backed into a corner. And one of the options was not nuclear war. They needed the sanctions to end. We needed them to stop with the nuclear nonsense. And we would like to invest in their oil fields. And by the way, they would like us to invest in their oil fields. So we come to a point where two countries, the evil empire and the great Satan, encounter each other and say, you know, we can do business. When did this happen? When the United States made a deal with China under Mao Zedong. While Chinese weapons were being sent to South Vietnam, killing American soldiers, the United States cut a deal with the Chinese to block the Russians. It's happened before. If FDR could ally with Joseph Stalin, a homicidal maniac, to defeat Hitler, another homicidal maniac, then American policy can be very subtle, and that's what you are seeing emerging in Iran. So what is the world looking like? The United States developing a higher level of sophistication than it had before. It couldn't go lower. China staggering in a cyclical downturn that had to happen. The Europeans discovering the underlying flaw in the construction of the European Union, German exports, and one country emerging out of this that I mentioned in my book, Russia. Russia is not particularly powerful. It is only stronger than everybody around it. And the Russians we have seen were instrumental in Syria, gave Snowden a place to stay without worrying about the United States, and is doing business deals all over Europe and Asia on energy and other things, mining, because they understand that their national security rests in their commercial operations. So we're now in a situation where a new structure of the international system is emerging. The Chinese have created an air defense zone, but have no fighters capable of operating deep into it because they don't have enough tankers. They're not a military power that they'd like us to think they are. The Europeans, as one enraged when I said this to a European commissioner, said, "We are going to solve this problem." I said, "Outstanding. Now's a good time." I'm not sure the Europeans even recognize what the problem is. It isn't the stress test on their bank. It is the agony in Southern Europe and to some extent in Eastern Europe. The Americans are intrinsically more powerful, not because we're virtuous, not because we're smart, and certainly not because we're subtle. It's just compared to everybody else, we do pretty well. And as to the emerging power, Putin has done a brilliant job, not in rebuilding the Soviet Union, but in resurrecting Russia as a great regional power. And we shall see the United States and the Russians, as they've already begun to do, duel with each other. And our Secretary of State Kerry is visiting the country of Moldova. If you don't know where that is, it really doesn't matter, even to the Moldovans. But it is very close to Russia, to Russian interests. A duel is happening. A very minor duel, not a Cold War. My game can't be resurrected. But it is a new age. Will we go back to the time when Europe was united and developing indefinitely? No more than we can go back to the time when Japan was going to be the language of industry. Can we go back to the time when China was growing profitably at 14%? Not really possible. One of the things at this point that everybody says is, this can't be a permanent change. Things as solid as China, things as solid as Europe, things as wretched as Russia can't change. And everybody waits for things to get back to the way they were. The only skill that I have is to have recognized that things frequently don't go back to the way they were. And I noticed that as I got older. No matter how much I exercised and how much I insisted I was still that young, my wife assures me that I'm not. In the biology of a human being, you can see the biology of nations. They evolve. They rise, they fall. They have different longevity. They suffer from different diseases. But the one thing you can be certain of about the international system, nothing is permanent. And what I've tried to lay out here to you is the manner in which the world is changing before your eyes. And I invite you to look at it without preconception, without desires, without hopes, to simply see what is happening. And that will be forecasting. Thank you.